The last category of ratios we'll look at are liquidity ratios. And liquidity is an interesting concept. It really comes from an important truth about business that a firm can be profitable and bankrupt and unprofitable and solvent, at least in the short term. That cash flows and value generation don't necessarily line up exactly. So a great example, so there's two good examples of cash flow, of good cash flow relative to profit, and that in our modern era, and those are Amazon and Groupon. So if you think about your traditional small time book retailer, they have a lot of inventory, right? There's a ton of inventory on the shelves in that store, expensive, and doesn't necessarily turn over very fast, right? You'd expect that maybe hot new books might sell quickly, but a typical book may sit there for quite a while. So it's expensive and it sits there, and that means that being a bookseller is actually very, very expensive in terms of inventory costs. And so in order to help facilitate booksellers being able to afford their inventory, publishers offered generous credit terms to book retailers. So 60, 90-day payment schemes, right, where you get the book, you put it on your shelf, you sell it, that you collect the money from the sale, and then several months later you might pay the publisher for the book. So for new books that sell quickly, that's a lot of cash that can then fund the longer inventory periods of for the rest of the catalog. And this was kind of how book retailing went. But when Amazon entered the scene, Amazon could order from publishers, and they knew exactly what their orders were because it was e-commerce. So they'd order from the publisher, sell directly to the consumer, sit on that money for 60 to 90 days, and then return it to the publisher. Which also meant, right, as Amazon grew, it had more and more cash because, right, if I sell $10 million, and let's just imagine that Amazon made no money on any of those sales, which is actually fairly accurate. So Amazon takes $10 million worth of books and sells it for $10 million. Well, that means they have $10 million of cash that they get to keep for 90 days. And then they can return that $10 million to the publisher. But by that point, they may have sold $15 million worth of books because they were on a pretty significant growth curve in the early days, right? So by the time the $10 million disappears, you have $15 million that replace it. And by that $15 million disappears, you might have $18 or $19 million to replace it, and so on. And so Amazon would have a constantly growing cash account even as they're not making any money. And they might spend that money. So that $19 million that's now sitting in the account, maybe they would spend all of it. And it wouldn't matter because ultimately there would be more money coming from the sales to repay the 19 plus have extra to spend more. And then if that all ran into trouble, you could issue stock and get a significant cash infusion to further the thing. All of this sort of begs the question, why would investors put money in a company that makes no money? This is still an open question for Amazon because they're not profitable, but I think investors probably rationally believe that the growth in Amazon is fueled by investment, and investment comes from not focusing on profitability or rolling profits back into the business. And so Amazon continues to be worth a large amount of money, even though the profits are not particularly good, because investors believe that ultimately the profits will come. Groupon is an even stronger example. When a person buys a Groupon from the Groupon site, they pay $50, say, to get a spa treatment. Then sometime later they go to the spa, turn in their Groupon. The spa tells Groupon that it's received, the Groupon from the customer, and then sometime after that, something like 30 days, Groupon then pays $25 to the spa. And so not only does Groupon make $25 on the sale, but they also get to sit on $50 for a pretty significant period of time, because the time between the sale and the turning in of the Groupon and then paying the company back is pretty lengthy. Now, they were losing money on every sale in the early days, but they grew at 2,200% year on year during their ramp-up phase. It's the fastest a company of that scale has grown ever. And so they had tons and tons and tons of cash because of this delay period. And now this is in contrast to there was a company that their market was to sell shrink-wrapped copies of Microsoft Windows to software retailers. Back in the days when you had to distribute these things with discs. And so they had the opposite problem, because Microsoft wanted payment right away. They didn't have credit terms, but their business was to buy large quantities of shrink-wrapped software from Microsoft and then sell it to small-time software retailers who didn't necessarily have the money to pay for it right away. In fact, they would prefer to put the box on their shelf, make the sale, take the money, and then pay their supplier. And so the small-time software retailers were interested in credit, and Microsoft was not interested in offering it, which meant that the company in the middle, that's serving as a middleman between Microsoft and these retailers, would need to front the cash to the retailers, and it would be cash they wouldn't have. This isn't a problem if you can get financing and then you're profitable, which they were. But the problem is that Microsoft software offerings were becoming more and more popular. So you think, well, this isn't a problem if you're a software middleman, that's your main product, right? This is a good thing, which it is for profits, but it's not for the cash position. Because if you think about, let's imagine that they take a $40 piece of software from Microsoft and sell it to a mom and pop retailer for $80. So there's a $40 profit there. Well, that means they need $40 in cash from somewhere, so say it's contributed by the owners. That 40 turns to 80, but by the time you get the 80, you need another 120 for new software. And by the time you get that 240, you need another 360 for software, and so on, right? The growth was sucking up all of the cash generated by the profits and more. And so the company was constantly in need of financing, and it really, really hampered the growth of the business. And ultimately the business was sold and generated a lot of value for the owners, but it would have been a much more profitable and effective and faster growing business had the cash proposition been better. So we really do care about cash independently of profit in its own right, and that's where liquidity ratios come in. So liquidity ratios measure the cash position of the firm, and they follow. There's three main ones. So the granddaddy of them all is the current ratio, and it's current assets divided by current liabilities. So really, this is how many dollars of things do I have that can convert to cash quickly, compared to how many dollars of things do I have that need cash quickly, right? So if I have, accounts payable, so these are, the electric bill and rent and things that the company needs to pay quickly in the short term. If those outstanding bills significantly outsize current assets, cash, inventories, receivables, something's going to have to be done, right? Debt is going to have to be raised. A bank loan is going to have to be secured. Something's going to have to be done because there needs to be money to pay these things in the short term, and there's nothing to pay it with. That's what a current ratio under 1 would tell you. And if you have a current ratio of 15, that means you have 15 years worth of expenses socked away in these categories. And that means current ratio is kicks on an interesting character in that if it's too small, it's dangerous, and if it's too big, it's wasteful. right? So if I have a lot of people who owe me money, and I have a lot of inventory sitting on the shelf, and I have a lot of cash doing nothing, all those things make my current assets high and make my current ratio really large. And those are not signs of a well-run business, right? We like receivables to get collected, and we like inventory to get sold, and we like cash to get invested. So having a high current ratio isn't necessarily a good thing, but having a low current ratio is definitely a bad thing. And again, the general idea behind these things is whether we have enough money to pay our short-term liabilities, and we can reasonably ask, well, so like if we look at Techni, it has a 230 odd day holding period for its inventory. Maybe we shouldn't really be counting inventories for Techni because it takes so long to sell them. So a ratio that does the exact same thing as current ratio but ignores inventories is the quick ratio. So it's current assets minus inventories over liabilities, or cash plus investments plus receivables over current liabilities. So obviously beating one in a quick ratio is harder to do than beating one in a current ratio. And so if you have greater than one with a quick ratio, that means your firm is in better financial footing than just beating one on the current ratio. Naturally, we can say maybe receivables aren't going to be collected in a timely manner, or maybe even at all if they're old enough and of low quality. And so a natural thing to do then is to throw those out too and just stick with only cash and investments. So the cash ratio is cash and investments divided by current liabilities, or current assets minus inventories minus receivables. Right? Those give you the same thing. And so if this is bigger than one, then your firm is in a more stable position than a quick bigger than one, which is more than a current bigger than one. Okay, so let's take a look at Techni and see how we do. And we can do these together, so let's go back up here and get to our Techni balance sheet here. So there's our Techni balance sheet. So we have so here in 2011 we have, let's do a copy job here because we're going to need these things. So here's our cash, investments, accounts receivable, and inventories. So copy and paste that over in our Excel sheet here. And then we need our current liabilities. Let's see. Oh, we actually have a total. They have a couple other categories that fall in current assets, so we might use the total current assets as well. Okay. And then we need the current liabilities. So here's our, right, so we have accounts payable and income taxes payable, giving us a total current liabilities of this. So I'll put that here. Okay, so if I do just a straight current assets over current liabilities using the totals, we get this 12.67 number. So that would be our current ratio, right? Current ratio because it is current assets divided by current liabilities. So now if we want to do the quick ratio, we would take the current ratio and, we would take, right, current assets and subtract inventories. Okay, subtract inventories, close that, and then divide by current liabilities, right? So we have current assets minus inventories over current liabilities, and get a value of 10.2. And then for cash ratio, we would take current assets minus inventories minus receivables, right? So there's receivables. Now, for Techne, this gets a little bit unnecessarily complicated because they have this category called other receivables that we don't necessarily know a lot about. So it's kind of a judgment call whether to subtract it or not. I'm going to. In the ones that you'll be dealing with, your data will be more well-defined than Techne is, since Techne is an actual company that has its own preferences for things. So we subtract the other receivables, then we get that. We divide by current liabilities. I get 8.11. So 12.67, 10.2, 8.11. And so we get the those three ratios. So obviously, right, if we think about Techne, is Techne in a position where they are in danger of running out of cash? The answer is no, right? They have, these are significantly bigger than one. They have a lot of cash, way more than their short-term liabilities are, and so we are not concerned that Techne is in danger of becoming insolvent in the near future. But this is not always true for other companies. So it's really kind of a safety measure to see whether companies will are in a good position to continue on in the short term, or if they're going to need to raise some additional financing. Okay, and that is it for this week. So thank you for hanging out for our 7-part series here. When we come back next week, we will be thinking about some cool time value of money stuff. So we're going to be progressing on to our simplest of all financial securities, the checking account. So that's our destination next. So thanks, and I'll see you next week.